Hello, I'm joined by Dr. Dan Plesch, Director of the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy. Dan, what do you understand diplomacy to be?
I understand diplomacy mainly to be the interaction between states, between governments, usually using professional diplomats in the foreign ministries of their countries, but increasingly direct contact between all sorts of government officials. And then, in addition to that, there are interactions by people and organisations who aren't directly connected to governments, perhaps most notably corporations.
Okay, thank you. In terms of your experience, what do you consider successful diplomacy to look like?
Well, that is a huge and open-ended question. I suppose, to take one example, it would be that no serious political action arose around the alleged illegality of the Iraq War, that a number of states considered bringing that forward in the international system and elsewhere, and the diplomatic pressure of the United States meant that this never appeared substantively, for example, in on the agenda of the United Nations. I think one can also look at the creation of institutions, the UN itself, NATO, the European Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Council. All of these are global institutions created by diplomacy. So that's perhaps two ends of a huge spectrum. If you're looking at particular issues, in recent years, the Iran deal with the United Nations on its nuclear program was an archetypal, knotty, difficult problem that was, at least so far, eventually resolved in contradiction to a large amount of received wisdom on both sides.
Okay. And conversely, what do you consider this failure of diplomacy to look like? How do we know when diplomacy has failed?
Well, sometimes war is a diplomatic objective. The famous A. Hitler, I think, would have seen a war as a triumph of state power, but all too often war, conflict, diplomatic, economic conflict arises out of the failure of diplomacy. I think one might see the message given by the American ambassador, April Glaspie, to Saddam Hussein before Saddam Hussein decided to annex Kuwait is an archetypal failure of diplomacy, in that I think she thought she was giving a limited message about hassles over a few oil pipelines, and he thought he was getting a green light to occupy the country. That perhaps is a very good example of recent decades.
Okay. And in terms of...
So clarity of message, I think, making sure that the other party actually understands what it is that you're saying is very often critical.
Okay. And in terms of your experience, who could you identify as being particularly skilled diplomats? Who do you admire in that respect?
Well, at one level, I think that a number of South Africans, ANC leaders, before the end of apartheid and afterwards, I think have to count as some of the world's greatest successes in bringing it out their own rise to power and a peaceful resolution to the situation in South Africa. So I think a number of South African diplomats I can think of. Perhaps unfashionably, I would also talk to George Bush Sr. Around the end of the Cold War, perhaps very conservative and not rising to the occasion as perhaps Roosevelt and Truman had done, but nevertheless managing the end of that conflict and managing summit diplomacy. I think famously Bush Sr. arranged a summit with Gorbachev they had one meeting and they wanted to arrange another one, and archetypally, he, in terms of summit diplomacy, he arranged the second one only using Gorbachev's translator, because at that point things were so sensitive he didn't trust any other American citizen to be party to that knowledge.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the skill set that a good diplomat has, what would you see as the key characteristics of those?
Patience, the ability to work extremely hard at all hours without losing one's cool. Negotiations, either formal or informal, can quite often run into the small hours of the morning, day after day, week after week. An ability to empathise with one's partners, and particularly with one's opponents, an ability to communicate to one's national government sometimes messages that they don't want to hear, or I think that perhaps is one of the most important ones, that very often, particularly nowadays, there is a mindset that doesn't necessarily want to hear an alternative view. Those would be some things I would put up quite highly, I think.
Okay. And just to follow up on one of the points you raised earlier, is there something particular, do you think, about the diplomacy of international organisations such as the UN?
Well, the theories would say it's about building norms and culture, and so that people in those institutions take on a life of their own by virtue of the people in them. And I think it's also the case that in a world of international bodies, that you may meet one official today, or you may meet one official in your 20s, and then you find out that you're across the table from them in your 30s, and you carry on meeting people in that culture. And I think that that strengthens bonds in a way in which it's hard to imagine, let's say, a world with the lack of institutions such as we saw in, let's say, 1900, when there wasn't that sort of institutional culture.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Simon.